Absolutely. That's great. Okay, I think we're ready to start.
Good to go, sir.
So welcome back, class. This is Michael Nacht, Nuclear Security. My turn to lecture after Professor Van Bibber on Monday. So I have one brief corrective comment to make, and then I want to just make a few additional comments about the syllabus before starting with lecturing through my slides. The corrective comment was I mentioned in the last time I lectured, which was last Wednesday, that the United States, after it dropped its two bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, probably was not going to have another bomb ready until November of 45. And a lab scientist who's auditing the class, Tom Tierney, Tom, I don't know if you're there, who's a physicist and team leader at Los Alamos, alerted me to the fact that that was not correct. That he had actually spoken with Harold Agnew. Harold Agnew is a world famous scientist. He passed away several years ago. He was a scientific observer on the Enola Gay aircraft during the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, and he later became the third director of Los Alamos National Lab. That Agnew told Tom Tierney that in fact a bomb was going to be ready by mid-August. And Tom has subsequently found documentation that there were a whole group of bombs that were to be ready in September and in October. Unfortunately, I can't share the details of that with you because Tom has been instructed that Los Alamos wants to have these documents under a Los Alamos Unlimited release banner. And until Tom gets approval, we cannot share the documents with you, even though they're unclassified. But when they are unclassified and approved, I hope that Tom will share them with us and we can share them with the class. So that's the correction. I stand corrected on that point. Is that clear? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Now, then the syllabus. Can we turn to the syllabus, Mensuk? Okay. So can we scroll down a little bit? A little more. So on the readings, stop with the readings. So there was a little confusion with the reading. So let me just clarify this. For a number of years, Professor Van Bibber lectured using notes on elements of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. And that was what was listed here under the required readings. But we've decided that it would be better if he presents slides as he goes. And those are the ones posted on B courses. And there is no separate document called Notes on Elements of Nuclear Energy and Nuclear Weapons. So scratch that from the required readings. Then in addition, the students are asked to read parts of 4 books. Here is the first book, Fred Kaplan. You have it here, The Wizards of Armageddon. I met Kaplan 30 years ago. I was lecturing at Harvard's Kennedy School, and he was a graduate student in political science at MIT. And he received his PhD at MIT. And then instead of going into academia or research directly, he actually went into journalism and became a very prolific author. This book is beautifully written, if you've had a chance to read part of it already. And he's written quite a number of additional books, including on terrorism and on a bunch of other national security subjects. He's still very, very active. So that's what that book is about. The next book is from Brad Roberts. Brad is a colleague and friend of mine. He's a noted nuclear policy analyst. He was a colleague of mine when I served in the Department of Defense. He was in charge of nuclear weapons and missile defense policy. And after he left the government at the end of the first Obama administration, he went to Stanford. And in residence at Stanford, he wrote this book, The Case for US Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century. So it's an analysis, but it's also an advocacy why the US does need nuclear weapons. And Brad actually has agreed to give a guest lecture in the class in March, in the middle of March. So he'll be appearing at that time. He has for 5 years now been the director of the Center for Global Security Research at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Livermore. So, and this is primarily a book about US nuclear forces and comparing them and contrasting them with the Russians and a few others. The next book by Vipin Narang. Vipin is a younger scholar. He did his PhD at Stanford, and he's a professor at MIT, and his specialty is on nuclear weapons proliferation, how other countries have sought to get or decided not to acquire nuclear weapons. And Vipin has a very nice conceptual framework for how to think about nuclear proliferation, and that's discussed in his book published by Princeton University Press, Nuclear Strategy in the Modern Era. Finally, going back to one thing Professor Van Bibber said at the very beginning of our conversation, this course was supported for 10 years by the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration of DOE, and their funding of the NNSC, the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium of the Department of Nuclear Engineering at Berkeley. And about halfway into that program, even earlier, I was teaching that course with Stan Prusin, an eminent figure in nuclear engineering at Berkeley. And we were asked by NNSA to write a book that covered the material in the course because NNSA claimed that they had looked nationwide and that there was no other course being offered that melded the technology and the policy issues the way we had done. So Stan and I began to write this book about 4 or 5 years ago, but then Stan terribly, unfortunately, got sick and died of cancer in 2015. It took about a year to get reorganized, and then a colleague of ours, Mike Frank. Mike is a graduate of the Department of Nuclear Engineering at Berkeley, has a PhD from that department, and he has been a weapons designer and a specialist on nuclear terrorism at Lawrence Livermore for about 15 years. And Mike and I have been collaborating on finishing this book. It's taking a while, but we now have a completed draft of the book. And that's listed there, Nuclear Security, the Nexus Between Policy and Technology. So it hasn't been published yet, but it's based on all the lectures from the class. And Professor Van Bibber has played a key role in shaping the book and in reviewing some of the chapters of the book. And Mansuk, and also 2 other colleagues, one from nuclear engineering, Austin Mullen, and another former student from history, an excellent writer, have reviewed all the chapters. So this is a draft text, but it tracks with the lectures and has both the technical and the policy material in it. So we thought we would share that with you. There'll also be some other readings that we'll ask you to look at, articles and testimony and stuff. As we go along, they'll be posted on B courses. So those are the required readings for the course. Are there any questions about the readings?
Do we just approach them throughout the semester and just finish them by whenever they're needed, or is there a certain kind of reading schedule?
They are in the, there's the, for Mansuk, if you could scroll down to the schedule.
Oh,
Here.
okay. Oh, that's my bad. I haven't scrolled down far enough in the PDF.
So there, the reading is assigned every week. So the first class, we is asking you to read the first 30 pages of Kaplan. Then the third class, this class, the chronology, which is posted on B courses, but also NFP, that's Nacht, Frank, Prusen, the introduction in the first chapter. Is it clear?
That is, yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay. So just try and follow along by the schedule of classes and catch up with the readings as you go along. You'll be well prepared for each lecture. Okay, now, where is the discussion, Mansuk, of the statement in the syllabus about the project?
That's a separate document, Michael. Mansuk?
Oh, do we have that document, the write-up of the project course, Mansuk?
Yes, I will share another file, which is about. Okay, can you see?
Yes. Can everybody see this brief summary here?
Right.
So it says the review of U.S. nuclear weapons policy. So the story here is as follows. Every semester, every year when we teach the course, we ask the students to collaborate through smaller groups on a particular issue of concern, which has technical and policy dimensions. In this case, what had happened over the last few years were two things. One was the Russians, led by the chief of their general staff, Valery Gerasimov, developed a policy of escalate to de-escalate. And what that meant was that the Russians were saying that if they needed to intervene in a situation with conventional forces, non-nuclear forces, that they might then use small yield, small scale nuclear weapons to deter the adversary, in this case, NATO and the United States, from retaliating. Now, what's happened in recent times is there has been deployment of Russian forces, large numbers of Russian forces near the Baltic states. These are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They're the three states in the northern part of Europe that used to be part of the Soviet Union. They are now independent, and they have also joined NATO. So they're NATO members, but there are Russian troops right on the border. In fact, I think I mentioned in the other class, the distance from St. Petersburg, the great Russian city, to Tallinn, the Estonian capital, is just about a 5-hour drive. So there's been concern in the United States that at some point Russia might intervene to seize control of one or more Baltic states using conventional weapons, using armored forces and aircraft, and then might use one or more small yield nuclear weapons to dissuade the United States and NATO from counterattacking. So this is a relatively new idea in Russian thinking that the US has been seeking to counter. And secondly, with respect to China, China's been very active in East Asia. We'll talk about that. They have developed a lot of military bases in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, just east of the Chinese mainland. And the forces they have deployed there, the United States is calling anti-access area denial forces, A2AD. The point of these forces would be, again, to deter or defeat US intervention in the event of Chinese aggression in the Southeast China Sea. So here again, the concern is, does the US have a credible retaliatory capability against the Chinese forces? Now, as a result of these two developments, the Russian escalate to de-escalate and the Chinese anti-access area denial capabilities, under the Trump administration, they decided, and President Trump approved, that the US should develop and deploy some very low yield nuclear weapons. Most of our weapons are still high yield. They're thousands of or hundreds of kilotons. And in the Trump Nuclear Posture Review, which is a document produced every 4 years by a new administration, there'll be a new one under Biden, probably later this year or next year. The Nuclear Posture Review for Trump called for the development and deployment of low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and sea-launched cruise missiles, SLCMs. But that was criticized when it was announced that it was unnecessary, that it would possibly stimulate early use of nuclear weapons in a conflict, which would not be appropriate. So we don't know, I don't think anybody knows right now, what the Biden position is on these low-yield nuclear weapons. So the project course is to determine, using 3 different groups, whether the low-yield SLBM and SLCM program should be continued or modified or terminated. And we're going to get you probably very soon into groups to begin wrestling with all the details of these problems, the technical, the political, the strategic, the diplomatic dimensions of each of these choices. So this is the main project course for the year. It's also important to note that the US and the Soviet Union originally in 1987 had agreed on the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, which were lower yield weapons. And that INF treaty was terminated because of Russian violation of the agreements just a year or two ago. So the continuation of the Trump policy would have an impact on intermediate force levels as well. Any questions then? We'll go into this in more detail and you'll have lots of time. We'll also devote some class time where the groups will meet to get into their group activities. But just as a once over lightly, I just wanted to get this project course description out now. Any questions?
For the project, will we be choosing the groups ourselves or will the instructors be dividing us?
I think we'll be assigning you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Okay, then I think we can, those are all the comments I wanted to make about the syllabus. Then we can now return to the chronology. Now, I should mention again, I want to just briefly review very quickly a couple of the core points from the chronology. The first point is that it was not the United States that was in the early frontier of atomic research. It was really a group of individual scientists, mostly university-based or research lab-based in England, in France, in Italy, and in Germany. And they were essentially modifying the paradigm that produced atomic physics. These were small groups. independent, they weren't even government funded, and the governments were not directly involved. By the late 30s, the Germans had made important progress in this area, and this was very alarming to American physicists because a lot of this work is being published in peer-reviewed academic journals. And this led Einstein to sign a letter that went ultimately to Roosevelt to urge him to start a nuclear bomb program. Now, I went over this, I think, a little too quickly last time. The British had, through the MAUD committee, the Military Application of Uranium Detonation Committee, they realized the applicability of atomic physics to nuclear weapons, which, by the way, eminent physicists did not. Rutherford didn't, Einstein didn't initially. This was not understood. And the British themselves were interested in starting a bomb program. But by 1939, 1940, they were in the war with Germany. They were being attacked from the air by the German Luftwaffe. They didn't have a lot of secure facilities. They also didn't really have the research capability, the manpower and woman power to carry out such a massive undertaking, which would be unique under these wartime conditions. So they sent a small group of British scientists to Washington and alerted the Americans of the need for the US to start a bomb program in which the British would participate. And that's what led to the Manhattan Project. That's what led to Oppenheimer from Berkeley, from the Berkeley Physics Department, becoming the scientific director of the Manhattan Project. And again, it was selected in Los Alamos in part because it was a beautiful area that Oppenheimer's family had vacationed in. But it was also remote, which was helpful. Okay.
I have a question, Professor.
Yes?
Did Berkeley have the Department of Nuclear Engineering during that time?
I don't believe it did. Carl, you would know that, but I'm sure, almost certain it did not.
Mansuk, the question is, did we have a Department of Nuclear Engineering?
In the early 40s. No, it didn't.
We had a program that started in 1956 or 57 by Mark Mills, and who actually later died in a helicopter crash. He was actually part of the test program for the early thermonuclear weapons down in the South Pacific. But by 1958, Thomas Pigford became the first department chair. And over the course of, I think I was the 12th chair, 10th chair or so, 4 of our chairmen have been from Livermore and 1 from Los Alamos. So, well, the weapons labs have played a significant role in shaping our department.
No, nuclear engineering did not exist as a concept in the 1940s.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we can go to, there are 2 slides left over from the last time, and then we get into the next round. So, the US-Soviet relationship was basically positive during the Second World War. We were both at war with Germany. And of course, the Soviets were involved in defeating the Germans, whose forces had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Throughout the war, there were differences between Churchill and Roosevelt as to what the US policy should be toward the Soviet Union. Roosevelt was quite warm toward the Soviet leaders and toward Stalin. Churchill was not. And Churchill was concerned that after the war, the Soviet Union would become a threat to the West. What neither Churchill nor Roosevelt understood at the time was that although the Manhattan Project was largely a British an American, British, and a little bit of Canadian project, the Soviets had agents in the project who provided an enormous amount of information to the Soviet leadership about the research on the atomic bomb. This later led to the arrest and execution of two American figures, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, which we might discuss a little bit later, and also to British scientist Klaus Fuchs and several others. And in fact, we now know from the opening of some Soviet archives, Russian archives, that at one point, Kurchatov, who was the head of the Soviet bomb program, told the KGB that they did not need any more information about the bomb program because they couldn't handle it. It was too many volumes were being provided by the Soviet spies to Moscow. What this slide shows in 1943 is that at that time, the Soviets obtained the Maud Committee report. That's the key report authored by British scientists showing how the atomic physics principles could be converted into an explosive device. Kurchatov was an eminent Soviet physicist. He became the head of the Soviet bomb program. And there was a big debate after the war when they would actually obtain when they would obtain a bomb. But again, in the early days after World War II, no one understood the depth of Soviet penetration of the Manhattan Project. So they were predicting 1955, 1960, and yet the Soviets detonated their first bomb in 1949, just 4 years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's a model of the Soviets' first atomic bomb in the lower right underneath the picture of Kurchatov, who has a large beard. Okay, so, and this then became in a way a cornerstone of the entire Cold War, the post-World War II relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, which was not just about nuclear weapons, but it did include a major nuclear competition between the two countries. Next. The other interesting dimension to this, which is less well studied, is what were the Germans doing? After all, they had these great scientists like Strassmann and Hahn and others who were in the forefront of atomic physics research. A key episode took place, which has never been fully explained. Niels Bohr was an eminent Danish physicist. That's his photo with a hat on. And Bohr was very involved in the forefront of atomic physics research and in the conversion of that research to bomb ideas. The Danish, for a while, were free, then they were occupied by the Germans. One of Bohr's students was Wolfgang Heisenberg, the famous Heisenberg, you know, of the uncertainty principle. And in 1941, in October 1941, Heisenberg, who by then had already been named the head of the German bomb program, went to Copenhagen to visit with Bohr. And the precise details of that meeting have never been revealed. Later on, a playwright in the 1980s, I think, wrote a play which was produced on Broadway called Copenhagen, which looked at various alternative explanations for the Bohr-Heisenberg meeting. Did Heisenberg come to tell Bohr that, because he knew that Bohr had connections in the West with the US and Britain, did he come to visit Bohr to tell Bohr, don't worry, as long as I'm head of the German program, we'll never get a bomb, I'll make sure we don't? Did he come to see Bohr because he needed some technical information to advance the German program? Was he trying to tell Bohr that Hitler might be willing to settle for some peace agreement without nuclear weapons? What exactly were Heisenberg's objectives in asking for the meeting with Bohr and in Bohr's accepting the meeting? It's interesting, quite recently, not long before he passed away, Stan Prusen, our colleague, actually visited Copenhagen. And there's a Bohr Institute of Advanced Physics Research there. And Stan was shown notes in Danish that Bohr had taken of the meeting, which have never been published, never been circulated. And Stan told me he had hoped to go back to Copenhagen and with a translator, translate the notes of the Bohr-Heisenberg meeting and reveal what was involved from the Bohr perspective. And I said, I'd love to carry your bags. But unfortunately, Stan passed away. And to my knowledge, no one has ever examined those notes.
Michael, if I can just intervene here, because this is a really fascinating chapter that Michael Frayn, who wrote the play, I think it was around 2002. It actually had a run in San Francisco. It turns out that as a consequence of the publicity associated with this play, the Bohr family, I think, did reveal that there were 3 or 4 letters that Niels Bohr wrote to Werner Heisenberg as a consequence of that meeting, but never mailed. So they were actually in the drawer of his desk. And the tone of the letter was angry, and it revealed that that actually, since at that time the Germans had already overrun Denmark, and that Heisenberg appears to have come in a fairly high-handed way, saying, look, get over it, we're the future, and so forth, although Heisenberg himself is responsible for this kind of revisionist history on that. But Bohr made it, his letters sort of made it clear that Heisenberg came in a fairly high-handed way.
I see.
Bohr's never liked it.
So the audio book for this is actually read by Benedict Cumberbatch. I have a copy if anyone is interested. The people in 29DD have to listen to it for an assignment. It's a beautiful, beautiful play. The other option was that Heisenberg was going there to tell Bohr that the Nazis are very likely going to assassinate him.
That they're going to assassinate Bohr.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And that you know, in later sort of revisionist history, as Carl said, it was Heisenberg's way of telling his mentor that you should get out of Dodge.
I see. Uh-huh.
But it's a really beautiful play, and Benedict Cumberbatch, his voice is like a panther and a cello. So if people are interested, let me know.
Great. Wonderful. Well, one key development here was that Heisenberg grossly exaggerated the amount of weapons-grade material that would be required for the bomb. Whether this was purposeful to deceive German scientists and the military who were involved, or whether he just made an honest mistake. But Heisenberg's calculations led to a tremendous delay in the development of the German program. And in fact, they never successfully built a bomb when they were defeated and surrendered in May 1945. And remember, this was the whole focus of the American effort. It was a race against the Germans to get the bomb. But ironically, then what happened was Germany was defeated in May 45. Alamogordo was tested in July 45. The bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 45. And the Japanese surrendered in late August and early September 45. So the bomb intended to beat the Germans was used against the Japanese. Okay, is that clear?
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
Hey, so I guess I'm confused why the Danish would never translate or release the notes from that meeting. That seems like it would have pretty high historical value.
Yes,
Seems weird
I
to me that it
agree.
would be.
Carl, do you know the answer to that? Why they haven't been translated? I don't know.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question, and I don't have the answer to that. It may be that they are still the property of the family. But if you said Stan saw it in a museum,
No, he saw it in the Bohr Institute.
the Bohr Institute. That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I don't know that.
This could be the great student project of the future.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going. I'll do it.
It's a beautiful city, Copenhagen. Okay, so those are some of the elements of the early chronology. Now let's move on. Now, after the war, after the Second World War and the detonation of the US bomb, and actually even before the detonation of the Soviet bomb, this is where the beginning of Kaplan's book starts. And he talks about the rise of American civilian strategists. Remember, this is about war, and war is normally governed by the generals, right? Professional military, they're the ones who make military policy. But Kaplan was saying that what happened here was that some American intellectuals realized that the enormous destructiveness of nuclear weapons meant that in some ways they weren't just military weapons, they were psychological weapons, they were political weapons for intimidation. The first major figure who emerged was Bernard Brody. He's of these four individuals, second from the left. Bernard Brody, who was a political scientist, who had written a dissertation on naval strategy at the University of Chicago. But after the war, he edited and contributed to a very important volume. This is really the first volume about nuclear war, called The Absolute Weapon. And in that weapon, we move on to the next slide. In that weapon, there you see, Brody wrote about sea power. Then he edited The Absolute Weapon. He worked with William T.R. Fox on another book called The Superpowers. William T.R. Fox was a political scientist who was also very interested in these issues, and he wound up directing a major research center at Columbia for many years. And just an anecdote, William T.R. Fox was my dissertation advisor. Yeah. So I knew something about this. And actually through Fox, I met Brody later in life. Brody later was at the Rand Corporation, and then he was a professor at UCLA for many years. One of the interesting anecdotes about Brody was he was not known to be the most galvanizing lecturer, and they said at times Brody fell asleep during his own lectures. I never saw that, but people have told me that he did. It was Fox who coined the term the superpowers. This is in 1944, envisaging a post-war world where the Soviet Union and the United States were the two dominant powers. Remember, before World War II, it was the British and the Germans who were the dominant powers. There was no God-given law that said the US had to emerge. As people began to struggle with what is the meaning of nuclear weapons in war, Lauris Norstad was a major military figure of the time, and Vandenberg, you may have heard of Vandenberg Air Force Base, it's not far from here in California. they talked about how to target different targets of the adversary. But Curtis Lemay was an Air Force general who was very involved in the bombing of Germany during the war, and he later became the first head of the Strategic Air Command. Lemay said, no, nuclear weapons are used for the total destruction of the adversary. And again, there's no God-given answer book at the back of the book here. They're all trying to understand what is the real role of nuclear weapons. These ideas later foreshadowed the debate between counterforce and counter-value targeting. Counterforce targeting is to target the weapons of the other side who can destroy you. Counter-value targeting is to destroy the cities and industrial capability of the adversary. So remember, this is the only thing that had been done was counter-city targeting. 2 bombs had been dropped against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There were military targets there, but they were as much used for shock effect as for anything else. And these are the early days of debate, both in the US military and the intellectual community, about what's the role of nuclear weapons in war. Brody made the point that he thought Japan surrendered not because of the damage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was terrible, and you have 120,000 people killed and all the radiation and the blast and all that, but out of fear of future attacks. Out of fear, if this is what the Americans could do against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what would they do against Tokyo? So Brody is wrestling with these early ideas, and he's edited this first volume, The Absolute Weapon. He slowly comes to the view that nuclear weapons can never be used in warfare, which was not the view of a number of his intellectual colleagues on the earlier slide. Let's go back to the earlier slide for a second. And so, yeah, here are 3 of the other titanic figures of nuclear strategy. Besides Brody, to his left is Albert Walsteader. Albert Walsteader was originally a philosophy major at Columbia, a very smart, very dogmatic individual. I met him near the end of his life. And he claimed that he felt he was at Columbia, his advisor at Columbia knew too little about his subject to be worthy to be his advisor. So he eventually quit the Columbia program and wound up being out at RAND. And it was at RAND, the RAND Corporation, which became a major think tank for the Air Force. And he made use of that to develop the first research project on nuclear strategy, in which he argued that by this time, the US was building weapons, land-based missiles, and aircraft. And Walsteader was very critical of where we placed these weapons, the deployment policy for these weapons, claiming that they were vulnerable to attack. Walsteader always viewed that nuclear weapons were usable in war, could be used, and would be used, totally different from Brody. So they had a big split on that issue. Later on, Walsteader wrote a famous article based on his earlier classified nuclear work called The Delicate Balance of Terror, in which he said it depends on who's got the edge as to whether nuclear weapons are going to be used. It has nothing to do with some biblical notion about not using terrible weapons. Later on in the 70s, I have a small anecdote there. He wrote an article claiming that the US was not in a competition with the Soviets because they were racing and we were not. Walsteader said they're racing and we are ambling back. He criticized the US for being way too lackadaisical in nuclear competition with the Soviet Union. And I was at Harvard at the time, and I was asked by the editor of the magazine where Walsteader published his article, he wrote the article, The Delicate Balance of Terror, that was in Foreign Affairs. The article about that we were ambling back was written in Foreign Policy, which is another journal that's used for policy analysis. I was asked by the editor of that policy if I'd want to be one of a few people to respond to the Walsteader article. So I did that. This was one of my first forays into this business. And I wrote an article with the title, The Delicate Balance of Error, which really infuriated Walsteader, although it had a lot of detailed stuff about what I thought were mistakes in Walsteader's analysis. And Walsteader became a godlike figure in the nuclear community. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, I think from Ronald Reagan. And actually, toward the end of his life, he had heart problems. And he was told by his cardiologist he needed to have a second heart surgery. And Walsteader said, no, I will review all the literature and I will decide if I need a second operation, not you. You can see sort of pattern to his relations with people. And he was reviewing the literature on his kitchen table one night and he dropped dead of a heart attack. So this was Albert Walsteader, really a major figure in the development of US nuclear strategy, to the left. Then to the right of photo of Brody is Tom Schelling. We read Tom Schelling's work in the other course I'm doing, PP 286 on US national security policy. And Schelling came up with many creative ideas about the psychology of deterrence and the role of nuclear weapons in that. Then finally, on the far right is Herman Khan. Khan was also a major figure. He was a UCLA physics graduate student. He took a summer off to go to the Rand Corporation and he never returned. He stayed at Rand for quite a number of years. And then later, he left Southern California. He was originally from New Jersey, and he formed his own institute called the Hudson Institute, which was based on the Hudson River in upstate New York. By the way, just as another anecdote, just today, Secretary Pompeo, the former Secretary of State under Trump, announced he was going to be a researcher at the Hudson Institute. It's become a conservative think tank, and it's based in Washington and in Indianapolis, Indiana. Khan was a very creative thinker, and he came up with different ideas for how nuclear weapons would be used in warfare. He wrote a massive tome called On Thermonuclear War, which is like 500 pages of different scenarios of uses of nuclear weapons. He then wrote a major book called On Escalation, whose ideas were originally used by the US in Vietnam. I met with Khan himself when I was writing my dissertation. He was a huge man, way over 300 pounds, and he spoke very, very rapidly. And I take away from that meeting, I remember, first of all, when he led us from the kitchen into a study, and he had to angle himself to get through the doorway. He was so gigantic, but pleasant and fun to deal with. And but at one point, he said to me, and I'll say it the way he said it. He said to me, "You're pretty smart. You understand about 70% of what I'm saying." I don't know if you understood that. He said, "You're pretty smart. You understand about 70% of what I'm saying." He's a super smart guy. And he unfortunately had a heart attack and died. I think he was in his early 60s or late 50s.
Hi, Professor Knott. I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So during the time when the strategists were considering using the atomic bomb for Japan, right, was a consideration because Japan obviously had history with biowarfare and chemical warfare, I mean, technology at least in experimentation wise, right? Was a consideration that they might retaliate with the use of those because I guess their nuclear weapon capability is not up to par. And was it a consideration that they would retaliate with using those? Because if they use
Who you're referring to is retaliating?
the Japanese, if they were
The
gonna.
Japanese had no nuclear weapons at the time.
Right. But they
They
did.
had a program, but it never bore fruition.
And but how about their bio and the chem areas? Because they were researching it. Hence.
Yes. But again, the Truman approach was a massive shock effect. It would be so paralyzing to the Japanese leadership and the people that they would just surrender.
So it wasn't a consideration then.
I don't think Japan had suffered tremendously during the war. There had been firebombing of Tokyo. The US had been bombing them unrelentingly, and Japan was on its heels. All the forces had to retreat to the Japanese home islands after being in the Pacific. They were clearly going to be defeated. Question was when and how.
Okay.
So I don't think a Japanese retaliation against the United States was ever in the cards. And students of the whole war effort claim that it wasn't that there was any God-given rule that said the United States had to prevail in World War II. It was, as much as anything else, its tremendous industrial base. They could churn out huge numbers of military weapons and had a great scientific capacity to be on the forefront of military technology. This is what did it, and it wasn't attacked. Remember, all these other countries, Britain was attacked, Germany was attacked, Russia was attacked, Japan was attacked, US was not attacked. Pearl Harbor was attacked, but that was the only attack on the American homeland. So the US had a sanctuary that it enjoyed that none of the other countries did. Okay. Other questions? Okay, let's move on. So there's the RAND Corporation today. RAND Corporation was established in Santa Monica, California, in Southern California there in 1948. It was originally started by the Air Force with the help of Donald Douglas, the chief executive officer of Douglas Aircraft, Douglas Aircraft was the major aircraft manufacturer at that time, before it became merged into McDonnell Douglas. And then I think Boeing took it over. Here you see at the bottom left, war games are being played. For the longest time, the existence of the RAND Corporation was itself classified. RAND just was a bland acronym. It stood for Research and Development. This was originally the only place where US military strategy was being thought through outside of the Pentagon. These were civilians working on nuclear strategy. Next slide. Here is a group right to the end here. Let's see. I don't actually recognize people in the top. I don't know. It's Obama. So this is in the Situation Room of the White House. It's in the West Wing of the White House. This is where key national security meetings are held. As you see, it only has room for about 12 people around the table and about 8 or 10 people on the outside. I've had the opportunity to be in that room a number of times. often on the back bench, not at the table. And there, if you look down below, you'll see more familiar people from the Trump NSC, the Trump National Security Council. There's Trump, the blonde hair in the corner in the right. This was an older picture, so it had the Secretary of State, Tillerson, was to his left on our right. Also, Major General, who was the National Security Advisor. Across the way, you see Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury. And in the back there, behind Trump's shoulder, you see Sean Spicer, who was the initial press secretary for Trump. A key organizational development at this time, it's just cited on the left side, was the National Security Act of 1947. This is when Truman was president, and it was felt that the US government had to reorganize itself if it was going to be involved in a protracted, non-shooting, but struggle with the Soviet Union. And the administration proposed and was passed the National Security Act of 1947. That act created all these organizations that had never existed before. The National Security Council and its staff were created in 1947. Those are photos under Obama and Trump of the National Security Council meeting. The Joint Chiefs of Staff. There was no Joint Chiefs of Staff before 1947. The main organizational pillar was the Chief of Staff of the Army, who had been George Marshall. But under the Joint Chiefs, it became a combined multi-service operation. There is one chairman of the Joint Chiefs. You may have heard the current chairman's name during this recent civil strife with Trump, Milley. He's an Army general. But there are members of all the other services on the Chiefs, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. That was another important innovation in organizational thinking about how the military had to get involved in multi-service planning for war. Then the Central Intelligence Agency. There was no CIA before 1947. In fact, if you go back in earlier years in the 20s and 30s, a famous American diplomat said, US doesn't do espionage. We do not, democracies do not read other people's mail. But that was viewed as excessively polite. And later during the Second World War, the US organized the OSS, the Organization of Strategic Services, which was a major espionage activity during the war. And then after the war, a bigger effort was needed, and that became the Central Intelligence Agency, which is headquartered in Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C. And finally, the Air Force was created. The Air Force didn't exist before 1947. Before 1947, there was the Air Corps of the Army. All that bombing that was done in World War II were done by aircraft that were in the Air Corps, a unit of the US Army. But because of the development of missiles and all that, it was clear that a separate military organization needed to be established, and that became the Air Force. So this was a truly landmark set of legislation. NSC, the National Security Act of 1947, establishing the National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs, the CIA, and the Air Force. And all these play a role in nuclear strategy. Next slide. Okay, move on. So going back a little bit to a little bit of the history of how we got into this Cold War with the Soviet Union. This is a map during the war. The Germans had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. and a key battle of Stalingrad, which I think is on the next slide. The Soviets retaliated and finally began to push the German army out of the Soviet Union and out of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union is in purple there, and these countries to the west, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, they were all occupied originally by Germany during the war. Next slide. There is Stalingrad. This was a key battle of the Russo-German War, in which the Red Army defeated the Germans in February 1943. It was originally called Volgograd and became known as Stalingrad, named after, of course, Stalin, who was the chief head of the government, head of the party in the Soviet Union. Okay. Oh, well, let me go back 1 minute to the down below there in the center of the screen up at the bottom are these other countries, all of which later became members of the Warsaw Pact, which was the counterpart, the Soviets' counterpart to NATO. You see there Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, later became there Slovenia, and the Czech Republic. Slovenia, by the way, is where Melania Trump comes from. Okay, now we move on. After the war, there was all this high-level diplomacy about what the post-war world was going to be like. A very famous meeting was held at Yalta, which is in the Soviet Union. There was Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin in the bench on the front and the left. That was in February 45, before the Nazis surrendered. Maybe the Germans surrendered in May 45. But Roosevelt died in April 45. And Churchill was defeated. In an amazing election, the British felt that he was a great wartime leader, but they didn't trust him for peacetime post-war development. So in the next big meeting, July 45, Stalin was still there. He went from the dark gray uniform to the white coat uniform. But the other two were different. Truman replaced Roosevelt, and Clement Attlee, the Labor Party leader, was elected, and he replaced Churchill. These were critical meetings to shape the course of post-war Europe. Okay. These were the bombs that ended the war, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both took place after these summit meetings. Remember, I mentioned to you that Truman was asked his staff to come up with ideas what to say to Stalin about the war, about the bomb, not realizing that he knew all about the bomb. Okay, next. This is a press coverage of the bomb. Now, here's another interesting point on the New York Times headline. Soviet declares war on Japan, attacks Manchuria, Tokyo says, atom bomb loosed on Nagasaki. Now, notice the dates. August 6th was the bombing of Hiroshima. August 8th is when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. August 9th is the bombing of Nagasaki. And August 15th, the Japanese surrender. In the actual official Soviet history of the Second World War, it just says August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war, and on August 15th, the Japanese surrendered. It doesn't mention the bombings. So so it's a true chronology, it's just incomplete. August 8th and August 15th, omitting August 6th and August 9th. Okay, continue.
Professor Knock,
Yes?
would you explain some, ethical, some debate related to the Hiroshima bombing and the Nagasaki bombing?
Yeah, so that's a whole large subject itself. Some Americans were criticized, the American government was criticized, Truman was criticized that if it were Europeans, we would never have, or white people, we never would have used the bomb, but we were anti-Asian. So we were much less relaxed, more relaxed about using the bomb against them. There remains a debate to this day about the ethics of using the two atomic bombs against two cities. In the detailed accounts by Truman, he was very pragmatic and very sort of matter of fact about it. He basically said, look, we were in a war. We had lost 250,000 people, or maybe 400,000 people by that time. We didn't want to lose any more. Some estimates were that if the US invaded the Japanese islands, it would cost 1 million men. And he said, if I had a weapon that could end the war earlier, I would use it. And if I didn't use it, and it later became known I had a weapon that could have ended it earlier, they'd have hung me in Washington. So Truman had a very pragmatic view of the bombing. And when he spoke to his advisors, including Oppenheimer, and the military and the civilian diplomats, they all agreed that the bombs should be used to end the war as quickly as possible. But there remains a lingering racist argument about their use.
I have a question.
Yes?
So, did such an ethical consideration and debate influence Truman's decision not to drop atomic bomb during the Korean War?
Well, that's an interesting question too. I don't think so. I mean, I think it was raised as an issue, but during the Korean War, which is 50 to 53, there were a couple of times when Truman considered using the atomic bomb. But Truman's view, again, was very practical. He said, these are weapons of mass destruction that should only be used in case the homeland of the United States is being threatened, not in case of just what was called a limited war, a war with limited aims, limited weapons, and limited geography, which was the Korean War. So Truman rejected the idea of using the weapons against the Koreans, but I don't think it was for racial and ethnic reasons. I think it was because of just practical and strategic reasons.
Why was the issue of racism in choosing whether or not to drop the bomb on Japan raised if the bombs were originally built for Germany? If the original intention was to be used on Germany?
Well, just that they were used against Japan. Just later on, it was it a racist motivated attack? There is a man, an author you might want to read. He's a prolific writer on the subject, Gar Alperovitz, Alperovitz, who wrote very extensively on what he thought was the immorality of the use of the bomb.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes?
So the argument that you just now laid out.
I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
A little better, but still not great.
Oh, I'm not muted, so normally it should be okay.
Maybe fix your mic and come back.
That's okay, yeah. Maybe I'll just send it by your chat. Thank you.
You can also post your question in the chat and we can read it for you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we're waiting for the question or moving on to another question? Okay, why don't I move on in the meantime, because there's more I wanted to cover. Okay, in the earlier days after World War II, the Red Army, the Soviet Army, had invaded all of Eastern Europe in pushing the Germans back out, and they went right into Germany. And they were solidifying their control of all those countries. Churchill, who was out of power at the time, was invited to a small college in Missouri called Westminster College. And it was there that he delivered the famous Cold War speech, in which he said, and now this is where the map comes in, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain, that's the red line, has fallen over all the great capitals of Eastern Europe. So this was Churchill's articulation of what the post-World War II world was beginning to look like. And also included the division of Germany. Germany was divided into 4 sectors: a German, a British, a French, American, and a Russian Soviet sector. And Berlin, the capital, was divided into 4 sectors. Okay, next slide.
Professor Knock,
Yeah.
next slide is about George Cannon's X article, and I think you may want to stop
okay.
here and answer some
Okay,
questions.
that's a good idea. We only have 5 minutes. So we'll talk about containment next time.
I think there are some questions that have popped up too.
Okay.
One from Sasha Kennedy. Sasha, do you wanna ask your question, or do you want me to read it?
I can do it. It's just more of a history question because I don't know the answer. But since half of Germany was under the Iron Curtain, and that wasn't lifted until like way after World War II, during World War II was half of Germany under Nazi control and the other half under Soviet control?
I mean, Germany was a united country under Nazi control till the war was ending. And the Russians were invading from the east, and the Americans and other allies were invading from the west. When Germany surrendered in 1945, in May 45, they split up the country into 4 sections. About 2/3 of the country were collectively British, French, and American sectors, and 1/3 of the country was Soviet controlled. And that lasted, the British, French, and American sectors ultimately were unified and became the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, about 2/3 of the German state. And the Soviet occupied area became the East German side, or the German Democratic Republic, GDR, which was among the most tightly controlled countries of all the communist countries in Eastern Europe. So West Germany was the Federal Republic of Germany, East Germany was the German Democratic Republic, and that lasted until 1989, 1990, when the Berlin Wall came down.
Is that good, Sasha? Awesome. I can read out the other question. It's more of a comment, and I feel uncomfortable saying it, so I'm just going to go ahead. The argument that bombs were used to end the war is a frivolous one. By that logic, any country could justify killing hundreds of thousands of people. I find it not only unsatisfying but self-serving. Had the U.S. lost the war, the U.S. leadership would have faced war crimes. Oh, that didn't feel good on the tongue.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think that's It's a fair comment. It's been raised before. I'd only say, war is horrible, and you have to put the shoes on, at least of the different leaders involved. If you put Truman's shoes on, he had been catapulted into this position of leadership with Roosevelt's death in 1945. He never knew anything about the bomb program. He was first briefed on it after he became president in mid-April of 1945. He was under gigantic pressure to find every possible way to end the war because American casualties were mounting. And he was presented with this new technology and this new weapon that could possibly end the war if it could shock the Japanese government into surrender. Now, one thing he could have said was, why could we not maybe negotiate different terms? Truman's position was unconditional surrender. In other words, we will decide, we the victor, you ever hear, to the victor go the spoils. We will decide what happens to the emperor, what happens to the schools, what happens to the political system. You will have no say in any of it. And that was Truman's position. He said, we want Japan to surrender unconditionally. And Japan said no. They felt that they could perhaps hold out, have the resistance of an armed attack by the US, in which the Americans would suffer a lot of casualties as well as the Japanese. Remember, they fought tremendously and bravely throughout the war. They were very tenacious fighters. But it was Truman's view that they had to surrender unconditionally so their authoritarian regime could not be rebuilt. And then when he was presented with the atomic bomb option, he took it.
If I could just chime in and add a couple of things, one of them personal. As I understand the history, maybe Tom Tierney will, or some of the other historians or archivists for the labs know this with more precision. Even after August 9th, the Japanese High Command were not impressed and presented the emperor with a plan that said by which if we armed the general populace at a cost of perhaps 25 million Japanese lives, we could rebuff an invasion. The emperor more wisely said, look, the time has come to put an end to the war. My father was a reconnaissance pilot and fought under terrible conditions in New Guinea, the Philippines, the Battle of Luzon, and so forth, working their way up towards Japan. He and his colleagues in arms, his comrades in arms there, were prepared in a matter of weeks to go into Japan. And I think they were, relieved when the war was concluded. At the time, to reinforce what Professor Knox said, this was so new, there was not a time to really develop the ethics, of what to do. This was the first real weapon of mass destruction we had. But the chemical weapons of World War I pale in comparison. In the same way, it's very difficult to go back and look in the 1950s at medical practices, people of good faith. If you read, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks and so forth, it was only until 1970, Belmont Commission, where we had kind of a architecture or a superstructure of how to think about medical ethics and informed consent and all that. So I think it took time, and in the heat of war, there was just not time to kind of develop this kind of reasoning. But the human cost of an invasion on both sides would have been unimaginably horrific. I don't defend the decision. We're just talking about the history of it. But my father was involved.
Right.
On a different note, I have a couple last minute logistics, if I can take 1 minute.
Yeah.
All right. I am going to put a link in the chat to the form for the personnel book. Please respond via the form, or if you're a lab person, you don't have an email you'd like to link to this, you can just send me the email. I think Mansuk sent that around. thanks very much. We'll have the book. Sorry, please respond to the form by tomorrow night, so I can finish the book and we can distribute it. We can all meet each other virtually. Thank you, Professor.
What is the next topic on Monday? The syllabus?
It's Preface Beaver's lecture.
Right. We'll be getting in, continuing with the phenomenology of atomic and nuclear physics, reactions.
Okay. That's a great lecture. Great. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Mansa, can you